Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan and all of us at Books and Books in Miami, Florida, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Jonathan Cohn to discuss The 10-Year War, Obamacare and the Unfinished Crusade for Universal Coverage, published by St. Martin's Press. Jonathan Cohn is a senior national correspondent at HuffPost and the author of Sick, The Untold Story of America's Healthcare Crisis and the People Who Pay the Price, which was a finalist for the Robert F. Kennedy and Helen Bernstein Book Awards. A former senior editor at the New Republic and executive editor at the American Prospect, Cohn is a two-time winner of the Sidney Hillman Prize for Journalism and was called one of the nation's leading experts on health policy by the Washington Post. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Sarah Kliff. Sarah is one of the country's leading health policy journalists who has spent nearly a decade chronicling Washington's battle over the Affordable Care Act. Her reporting has inspired new legislation in Congress, been cited by the Supreme Court, and resulted in multiple hospitals revising their billing policies. Sarah is an investigative reporter at the New York Times, focused on healthcare. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of The 10-Year War from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual screen. Hi, Jonathan. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Well, it is so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to Books and Books for hosting us. Thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me to moderate this event. I've obviously been a follower of Jonathan's journalism and an admirer of it for the time. He's been reporting on healthcare and the Affordable Care Act, and it's just such a pleasure to be here to talk about his new book, The 10-Year War, Obamacare and the Unfinished Crusade for Universal Coverage, which I think is actually quite relevant at this particular moment with Democrats being back in power to look, and it really tells the story of, I think, what Jonathan describes, and I think he's right, as the most, major piece of legislation of the Obama administration, how it got done, how it was challenged, kind of what it tells us about the legislative process. So I have a lot of questions for Jonathan after reading it. I'm sure our listeners will as well. But I think we're going to start with you, Jonathan, just some remarks on, the topic and, telling us a little bit more about this project you've been working on for a number of years now.
Yeah. So first of all, thanks to Books and Books, and I am so excited to be here with you, Sarah. It's, as I said, I put a Facebook note about this earlier today. I think there are no words in the English language that strike more fear into the hearts of a hospital administrator than Sarah Kliff is on the line. For those of you who don't know, she's done many things, but especially now, she is a sort of one-person wrecking crew on hospital billing. And actually, legislation is being written because of what she's done. Hospitals have changed their practices. It's just remarkable, and I think just a model for great public service journalism. So I'm very excited to be here with you. The book. We both have lived this experience, the Affordable Care Act. I feel like it was a sort of defining political domestic policy fight of the Obama/Trump era. And actually, it's funny. I'm not to turn the tables on you and ask you questions, but I remember when when Obama signed the Affordable Care Act. So this is March of 2010. And I remember having a sensation. I actually, at that point, gave some thought to trying to write a book on it because, followed it all along. But I remember thinking, well, maybe I had a sense that we were going to move on, that the sort of conversation would shift. And actually, you talk to people and and Obama talks about this in the book. He thought it would. I think everybody thought that as intense as that fight was, things would kind of calm down and we'd move on. And it would be sort of part of the normal landscape of American politics. And instead, here we kept fighting about it. And by the time, it's funny, in terms of writing the book, there were many moments in the last 10 years I kept thinking, well, maybe now I'll write that book. I'd kind of start an outline, I'd do a couple of paragraphs, I'd do a chapter, and it just kept going and going and going, and it never ended. And I finally felt like when, you know, the Republicans got elected and they tried to repeal it, and I'm not going to lie here, I thought they were going to repeal it. I didn't think it was survive.
Me too.
People,
I also thought they were going to repeal it. Right?
I mean, who knew? There were people, as the book says, there were people like Jean Lambrew who, you know, believed it would survive. Who's a character in the book. She's was a former advisor in the Obama White House, who's both Sarah and I know. And it was when that ended up, when that repeal failed, and then the Republicans lost in 2018 and hit that, you know, lost in the midterms. I was like, okay, maybe now, like, we're at a kind of place where we can stop and look back. And I also felt like it had been enough years that we knew what this thing looked like on the ground, right? You know, okay, what's working, what isn't, and very much with an eye towards both fixing healthcare in the future. Like, okay, what still needs to be done? Because obviously our healthcare system is still really screwed up. So, but also taking a step back and like looking at the whole political process, like, okay, does our political system even work anymore? And so I sort of felt like a good time to tell both of those. So thus the book.
Yeah, so let's talk about the book. So why don't you tell us a little bit about kind of, maybe we'll start with the beginning, about this crusade for healthcare we've been on for many decades. Kind of describe the long trajectory of this that leads us to Obama deciding to take on healthcare, and why was it so hard? You know, I think you had a lot of our peer countries doing universal healthcare in the 1960s, but the US, you know, never quite got there. What was different about us, and why did it take so long to even get to the Affordable Care Act?
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, the realities, as you know, of healthcare, the math of healthcare is the same everywhere around the world. It's the same basic problem, is at any one time, there's people who need medical care. They're a minority of the population. But they represent like the lion's share of the spending. And really going back to like the 1920s, it was more than your typical middle-class person could afford. And as we go forward in time, the cost of a particular medical incident, whether it's an injury or an illness, becomes more than almost anybody can afford. So, you know, today, unless you're really a millionaire, you know this better than anybody. If you get hit with a hospital bill, you could get really wrecked by it. Every other country decides at some point to kind of, you know, the math of it works out. The easiest thing to do is to get people in these pools together, and when you're healthy, you pay in, and you pay more than you get. But then at some point you get sick and it covers your bills. Every other country at some point goes to a universal coverage system where everyone's in, you know, one of a series of sort of pools together. We never take that path. We kind of diverge, and there's actually, like, political scientists have a word for this called path dependence, which is, you know, we kind of get on this separate road where we're going to rely on private insurance, and it's going to be organized around employers. And basically every kind of year we kind of keep going down that road. It gets harder to get off that road, right? Because more and more people are settled in their arrangements. There's an industry growing up around it that's making money off it, and they're going to want to protect their profits. And then there are broader political forces, which is that in order to do a universal coverage system, that is going to involve the government getting really involved, which, you know, in the 1930s, the New Deal seemed pretty, you know, that's what they were doing with everything, Social Security, and up through the 1960s, and they created Medicare. But after the 1960s, there's a real backlash against government in this country, and there's a real skepticism of it. And so I always sort of say, like, where the Democrats found themselves in the late 20th century, early 21st century, is on the one hand, Democrats had really been the champions of universal coverage. Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson, all the way up, you know, and yet at the same time, just they kept trying and they kept failing. And it was the collision of these two, this desire to get to universal coverage and this incredible frustration, disappointment that every time they tried, they just crashed and burned.
And then can you talk a little bit about President Obama's role in this? I know you were able to interview him for the book. Kind of and you wrote about this a little bit in the book as well, some of his personal lived experiences. What do you think made him both want to make this a priority, and, you know, this is probably a bigger question, but what are the factors that let it be successful in 2009, 2010 in a way it was not able? There were just so many failed attempts before. Yeah. Maybe we start with Obama. Kind of what is your sense of what motivated him to tackle this issue?
So, it was so interesting, and I don't know about you, but when I read about politics, I'm a policy reporter, right? So I tend to think of, when I think of politics, I think of these, like, everything's about the sort of big pieces of policy and the big, forces in American politics. And I tend to, like, minimize the role of individual people. Like, I've never been like someone who does a lot of profiles of politicians and that kind of thing, partly because, like, I'm really bad at it. When I was doing the physical descriptions in the book, I actually called writer friends and I would send them pictures. I'm not making this up. I would send them pictures. And I'd say, can you help me describe this person? I'm so bad at it. Like, I was describing you right now. I'd say, she's wearing like a yellow sweater and she's got long hair.
Well, I sympathize. I would definitely not be one of the writer friends you'd ask. So I'd be like, well, what about the medical bills?
Right.
So I empathize with you.
Yeah. And it was so funny though, because as I did this book, and I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to make this a readable story. I did. I thought, let's do this in like a way that's engaging. And so I paid attention to people. And it was funny in the course of doing that, I realized that actually people were important, that actually, like, who's in individual roles in the story is important. And I really think Obama's really important, like who he is. And I ended up reading these biographies of Barack Obama and like talking to people who knew him a long time ago, just to kind of get his mindset. And you see like the formation early in his life that sort of shapes his worldview later. And so one of them is he has this experience. His mother, when he's in his 20s, I think he's in his 20s, she's this very vibrant, intellectual, energetic, and she actually gets cancer and she ends up dying from cancer. And he watches this, and she's really the kind of formative figure in his, he describes it in his memoir as, she's like the dominant figure in his life. And he has to watch her while she's, battling cancer and, and just struggling with it. In the middle of all that, she's worried about her medical bills. And it was turned out, and they were fighting whether to cover it. It was actually a disability policy, not a healthcare, but it's, to in general person, like, struggling with medical bills because of insurance. And that left a big impression on him. He also, Obama, and again, this is like so far out of my lane normally, but I'm convinced it matters. If you talk to people, the fact that he had this sort of multiracial upbringing, and he talks about this again in his writing, sort of being a part of all these different communities. He lived in Indonesia for a while, and yet not quite fully a member of any one. I think he had something in him that believed strongly that sort of a good society is one where everybody belongs and everyone is sort of part of one group. And I really think that matters to him. And you see that as like a through line, quite apart from healthcare, I think, in his political career. And it kind of explains why he's always like, his famous speech, there's no red America, there's no blue America, there's the United States of America. So I think that was all really important. And, and then, he does, he gets the Illinois state legislature, and I thought it was super interesting. I knew some of this, but I learned a lot more in the research.
No, I learned a lot more from your book too. This was all totally new to me, the stuff that he worked on there.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I will tell you, it was actually funny. When I was doing, so just for the people listening, when Obama, he gets out of law school, he joins a Chicago law firm, and he ends up running for the state Senate and winning. And he ends up working a lot on healthcare. First, he's in the minority, which is super interesting because, of course, it's a Republican majority. They don't want to do a lot on healthcare. And then towards the end of his career, the Democrats take over, and he really gets a chance to run things. He's actually chairman of the health committee and ends up working a lot. I didn't realize this, but I mean, healthcare was like his big issue when he was an Illinois state legislator. And a lot of that has to do with his constituents. He's hearing a lot of stories from people that will resonate, later on, of people who are working poor and they can't get, they're too rich to qualify for Medicaid, but they can't get their health insurance. But Illinois, it's like the United States. Like, I mean, even when the Democrats were in the majority, it's sort of the power is tilted towards the rural parts of the state. He's really got to work with the conservatives a lot, and he ends up, working and sort of going to these downstate, rural areas and convincing voters to put pressure on their state legislators. And it was so wild to me how much they tracked what happened in the ACA, but he really works hard to get the Republicans on board, and he works hard to get the insurance lobbyists. And at the end of the day, like, the Republicans all oppose it. And he's like really disappointed, but it does pass, right? I always felt like I wish I could like cue music as the reader is doing this. I'm like, this is like a, like foreshadow. I will say the funny part is just, and this is, I don't know if this is because I'm older, my brain is full, but there was literally a moment where I was reading a clip on what had happened. I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. Where was, and then it was like a footnoted to a source. And I followed the footnote. It was actually something I'd written in 2007. I'd forgotten I'd written about it. But because I guess when he was running for president, I must have done a short article on it. So anyway, I thought that was all super fascinating. And it totally predicted the way he would operate once he was president, and this sort of, I'm going to bring the two sides together. I really care about this. And of course, he's a detail guy. He actually gets in the weeds of this stuff in a really big way, as opposed to, say a president who occupied the White House after him. But I guess we'll get to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who knew healthcare could be so complicated?
Should have asked you.
Yeah, so let's keep going. So let's talk about Obama. He gets in the White House, and you write about, there's all these different ideas they could approach, and they're talking about different avenues. I know they end up on Massachusetts Avenue, but can you tell us a little bit of how does the Affordable Care Act and the idea of working off of Massachusetts, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Massachusetts models, like how does that come to dominate the White House approach?
Yeah.
Why is that, of all the options they could have taken, the one they end up with?
So, I think the most important thing to know about the Affordable Care Act is that it came after the failure of the Clinton healthcare plan, like 15 years before, or 13 years before. And, Bill Clinton was president. They tried to do healthcare. They totally failed. And it left this deep psychic wound in the Democratic Party. And for years, they didn't want to talk about universal coverage. But the people who did healthcare, they obsessed over how do we, we've been failing at this for 60, 70 years. And the last one was just the worst of all because we thought we were close and it all fell apart. We lost the House of Representatives. And they kind of came up with a set of principles for okay, what did we do wrong last time? Let's not make those mistakes again. So, the big one, or one of the big ones was, whatever you do, don't mess with employer insurance because that'll spook people. Even if people don't like their employer coverage, you tell them you're going to take it away from them and they freak out. And that's, so let's not do that. Also, we can't beat the drug industry and the hospital industry and the medical industry if they all, unless, even if one or two of them come out against us, especially the drug industry, we're screwed. They're too powerful. They own Washington. They have a big advertising budget. So we're going to have to sit down with them and come up with some way to negotiate something where they give up a little and we can change the way they're paid so we can start to get a handle on costs, and that can free up money we can use to cover people. But it's not so much that they really feel threatened. Otherwise, they'll fight us and we'll fail again. And, let's try to avoid, let's lean on private insurance if we can more, so we don't sound like we're doing big government, because that's still a toxic label. And we know the politics of this. And we know the U.S. Senate in particular has a lot of conservatives in it. Those principles were sort of the basic, where they were on this going in. And then, lo and behold, in Massachusetts in 2006, they pass a plan like this. And not only does it fit this criteria, but it's got a Republican governor, Mitt Romney, was the architect of it. And all the interest groups are on board. And the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, they have scholars praising it. And, it was funny when I interviewed Obama. This is one of the things I wanted to ask him. I said, so, why did you? Because in his campaign, he endorses this plan, a version of what became the ACA. And I was going to ask him if Massachusetts was important. But before I even did, he said, well, we had this general idea. Everyone, all the Democrats, we were all talking to the same people, thinking along those lines. And then Mitt Romney did this thing in Massachusetts. And it's I was oh, okay, well, I guess it really was Massachusetts. And, he said very candidly, and I think this is true of all the Democrats at that time, they didn't think this was ideal. They didn't think this was a great way to do universal coverage. And a lot of them would have liked to do Medicare for all or something else that was more comprehensive. But I really think it's important, and this is less about Obama and more about the Democrats in Congress, but when you look at the list of the architects of this in Congress, so Ted Kennedy and Max Baucus, who were senators, and everyone knows who Ted Kennedy was. Max Baucus was in charge of the Finance Committee, and in the House, you had people like Henry Waxman, Congressman from California, and John Dingell from Michigan. These guys had all been working on universal coverage forever. And they were not to be blunt about it, but they were old. I think they all knew In Kennedy's case, when he got diagnosed with brain cancer, he really knew this was their last shot at it. And Kennedy, and this is another thing that's part of the book, like how much Ted Kennedy is in my book is not something I had planned originally, but in talking about the history, it just kept coming up as like a formative person in the early parts. And he would always tell people his biggest regret as a politician was that in the early 70s, when he came real close to negotiating a program with Richard Nixon, and that fell apart because liberals, including him, sort of thought they could get a better deal. And he regretted that afterwards. Like, you know what? That Nixon plan wasn't what I would have wanted, but it would have been a it probably would have looked like the ACA. And they all were like, we're not going to hold out for the perfect. We're not even going to hold out for like the second best. We're like, we're going our fourth best solution because we think it'll pass.
Well, I think that also speaks to the importance, like you were saying earlier with Obama, the importance of the personalities here. Like the fact that you have a lot of elder statesmen who saw this as their last chance to do healthcare, who happened to be in office and also had the expertise, right? Because it almost feels like the flip side of Obamacare repeal, where there was this desire to do something, but like the groundwork hadn't been done. Like these guys had really been thinking about this and like figuring out the groundwork for really decades when you get to like 2009, 2010.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think those four I mentioned in particular are really kind of all very good examples. So Kennedy, Baucus, Waxman, and Dingell had all been working on this, and they all, I mean, and Sarah, you know, these people are you know, I imagine, given who I think may be watching this, some of the people watching this cast may know, they may actually be on this cast, but you know, the staffers who worked for people like Henry Waxman or Ted Kennedy, who had been doing this for so long, and they all knew each other, and they had that expertise, and they knew every nook and cranny of the federal code, and they also understood the art of passing legislation, which, as you know, is just really hard to do. And they understood when you compromise, when you hold out for something, they had an enormous amount of expertise. Their staffs had expertise. And I really think it was really important also that like there was a parallel effort going on outside of Congress with like the private advocates, you know, whether it was, you know, all these really boring think tank reports all the time that people glaze over. Actually, it turned out they were important, I think, because they were like working out the fine details so that when Obama gets elected in 2008, they've already kind of worked out the basics of what they want to do. They've already actually worked out a lot of the numbers. You know, they've already figured out what they know what the trade-offs are basically. And so even then, like, it was super hard to do, but you know, they really could get a running start. And I do think that was really important. And having those, you know, people who valued that. I think, I always heard that like Kennedy and Waxman both were sort of very famous for hiring the smartest people they could find. And they were not afraid to get staff who were smarter than they were. You know, a lot of that takes a certain amount of intellectual security.
One of the things I really felt came through in a way, I don't feel like I got it when I was reporting on it, but it really came through, was the role of the financial pressure on this package, the keeping it under $1 trillion. Can you, and I think we have some questions in the space too, and I would encourage the audience, I do see some questions coming in, I'll start getting to them. So if you have them, you can ask them using the button at the bottom of the screen. But can you talk a little bit about like the financial environment in which this was crafted, and how I came to think, reading your book and just thinking about it, you know, 10 years later, like that was so much more important than I think I originally thought. Just how do you think about the financial environment and kind of this desire? Can you talk a little bit about this like desire that's pervasive to keep it under $1 trillion?
Yeah. So, I mean, the basic mechanics of what you're doing in a plan like this, right, is you have to, at some point, if you're going to do universal coverage, part of what you need to do is the government's going to have to spend money. It's going to have to either spend money to provide health insurance directly through like Medicare or Medicaid or some new program, or it's going to have to give people tax credits or tax breaks, or some kind of subsidy so they can buy private insurance. And that's the nature of the beast. No matter what kind of plan you have, it's some combination of those. And how much you can help people is going to depend on a couple things, but you know, there's a couple variables, and the biggest one is how much are you going to spend? And that's going to determine how much you can do. And so when they were sort of putting together this plan and they, they had numbers to work with, it was pretty clear that to really get to a real universal coverage system, one that looked vaguely like what we would see if you went to France or Germany or Japan or, whatever. Like you were like well north of $1 trillion over 10 years. And just why we've talked about 10 years, there's a budgeting window that Congress uses, a 10-year budget window. And it's up to something called the Congressional Budget Office to estimate what, when you propose legislation, the CBO goes through it and says, okay, this is what's going to cost, this is what's going to do. And it was pretty clear before even CBO got a crack at it, just from studies they had done internally and from an MIT economist we all know named Jonathan Gruber, very, very important figure in this story at times when he didn't want to be, that you really had to spend more than $1 trillion to get to truly universal coverage. And politically, that just was not going to happen. There was a lot of pressure, especially from more conservative Democrats and Republicans, but especially, we should say that they were trying very hard to get Republican votes, but they also needed to hold on to the conservative Democratic votes. In Democrat, they started the year with 58 in the Senate, especially they started with 58 Democratic senators. They ended up with 60 because one switched party and there was one that had been in dispute, an election that had been in dispute. And the conservative Democrats, especially back then, they were like very opposed to spending money. They didn't want to seem like they were big government spenders. And that's because, and maybe we'll get to this later, the United States Senate skews power, in the direction of these smaller, more rural states. So you had senators from like Arkansas and Louisiana and North Dakota who, through some combination of personal philosophy and a belief that they had to satisfy the voters, did not want to spend more money. And $1 trillion was, and even at the White House, they thought they were, the political advisors were like, $1 trillion sounds like a lot. And it's important to remember, when Obama got in, the very first thing they did was they passed a big stimulus, kind of like he's trying to do now. And that was a big fight to get it. They ended up spending about $700-800 billion. And honestly, everyone now agrees it should have been much bigger, but there's pulling teeth to get that much. So you'd already spent that much money, and now you're going back and saying we want another big spender that's going to, for the first 10 years, is going to be more than $1 trillion. And there was all this pressure to cut down on the money. And they really had a hard time fighting to spend more. And in fact, as the debate moves on and it gets harder and harder to pass this thing, the number keeps coming down. At one point, Obama, in a speech, says, this big speech in September of 2009, when he's addressing Congress and trying to kind of pick up momentum to kind of finish the bill, he says, this thing is going to cost around $900 billion. And Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats, their heads exploded. They're like, what are you doing to us? We're doing everything we can, to get it under $1 trillion, and you just another $100 billion. And it was a real struggle. And by the end, as they get close to the end of getting, negotiating this before they finally pass it, there's a kind of there's a recognition that they haven't spent enough, and that as a result, this is going to hurt it. And even like Max Baucus, who didn't want to spend a lot of money, and he's kind of a proxy for the more conservative Democrats. He even his staff, they're like, yeah, we should bump this up. But now you're into a problem was they were totally committed to reducing the deficit. And I think a lot of that was actually principle. And some of it was political. It was part politics. They thought they had to look like they were, if they didn't want to be seen as raising the deficit, but also for Obama and for his budget advisors, like Peter Orszag, a big reason to do this was to control federal spending. And that really limited their ability to add spending to it, because if you wanted to add $50 billion, let's say, which would have made a difference probably, you had to find $50 billion. Where are you going to raise taxes? You're going to take it out of the pharmaceutical industry. And there's a quote in the book from Karen Nelson, who was Henry Waxman's advisor, basically saying they felt like they were in this box. Every time they wanted to increase spending, they'd be like, fine, we're going to get the money. And they couldn't find the money because senator from Indiana wouldn't let you raise the device tax. And the senator from here, and it was just, they were kind of stuck.
Sorry, the listeners might hear a bit of bedtime background noise.
I love the background noise. And the background noise is awesome.
Which is sorry about that.
That's right. They can come in the
Sorry
screen.
about that. Okay, so I'm going to go to one of our reader questions. Sorry, just catching us in the middle of toddler bedtime here. So what do you, we would, one watcher who's wanting to know, what were the biggest mistakes made by the Democrats in the 2010 era, or biggest missed opportunities from drafting the ACA?
Yeah, well, I think we just talked about a big one, which is I think they got tracked to spending less. I think if you rewind the clock, probably they could have put themselves on a trajectory to spend a little more money. And even if it was only moderately more, I think it would have made a difference. It wouldn't have taken that much more money to make the program more generous so that a couple of years later, when people are buying insurance, it doesn't feel like such a shock. I mean, this was a big problem in 2013 and 2014, especially when the law is first being put into effect. People are going out to buy insurance, and the new coverage is a lot more expensive, and they're supposed to get subsidies to help them. It's not enough. Obviously, they could have gone more quickly. That's the I think what everybody says is, the negotiations to get Republicans on board, and then, it took forever. I mean, the original plan was to pass this thing by the summer, or the latest, the very beginning of the fall. It takes them until March of the following year. But I will say one thing, and I say this in the book, and actually someone just wrote a review in which they thought I was copping out, and maybe I am copping out. But I have a real hard time getting really worked up about mistakes and second guessing, because I think this stuff is a lot harder, a lot easier looking back, than it was at the time. It was tough. I mean, and certainly people were saying we need to speed up or whatever. But so I interviewed Harry Reid for the book, the former Senate majority leader. And fun fact, Harry Reid's office is in the Bellagio, the hotel. Yes, little known fact. And so, you can go see.
So did you interview him in the Bellagio?
I didn't actually. I ended up going to his house that day. I was but I actually went to his office, and then, so, I was like, oh, this is cool. Interview, Harry Reid, and go hang out, when they filmed Ocean's 11. And I asked him, and he was fascinating. I'd actually never interviewed Harry Reid before, and you may have. I don't know. I haven't. No. He's very funny, and he's sort of. I had this impression because he has this reputation as he's a former boxer, and he's kind of really tough, and he's actually comes off as this very sweet old man. I'm sure that to other people he is much tougher. But I asked him. I said, "Don't you wish you'd gone quicker? Couldn't you have pushed Max?" And in this, the negotiations dragged on. Everyone else was ready to go, but was Max Baucus, the Senate Finance Chairman, negotiating with Republicans, and he wouldn't pull the plug, and the White House wanted him to stop. So let's just move ahead, forget the Republicans. And Nancy Pelosi's screaming, and Max Baucus keeps going. And I asked Harry Reid about this, and then I talked to some of his staff afterwards, and they said, "Yeah, this is he thought this," which is. He said, yeah, it took a long time, and probably, and he didn't, I'm paraphrasing a little here, so reading a little bit into between the lines, but it took a long time, probably would have been better to go a little more quickly. But he said he thought it was so important that he knew this was going to be a tough sell. And it was important that the members of his caucus, the other Democrats in the Senate, the ones who were wary of this, had a chance to feel comfortable with it and to get involved. They had to see that, the effort to get Republicans was in part to satisfy conservative Democrats, to say, hey, look, we really tried, we did our best, and they're just not with us. And also he said, that by the time they were done, they'd all put some time into it. They'd all gotten their amendments in. They had a sense of ownership over it, and they felt comfortable with it. And so that when he had to go to them, at the very end and say, I need you to vote for this, they were already kind of on board because they'd gotten themselves on board. And, and again, it's such a contrast to 2017, where they tried to rush a repeal bill through, and they skipped the committee process. And you saw this over and over again in that process, and you remember this, Sarah, I'm sure, that a bill, that they wrote the bills inside, the House Speaker's office, and then Mitch McConnell's office in the Senate, and then they show it, and the members were like, what are we doing? We're they had no idea what was in it. They didn't know how to message it, and I think was a big reason why they struggled.
I wanted to read, there's I hope it's not a spoiler alert for people who haven't read it yet, but from the very end of your book, I just really liked your conclusion on it. I was hoping you would talk about it. Just made me I'll read it, and I was interested in kind of how it makes you think about the future of progressive legislating. So you write at the end of your book, the Affordable Care Act is a highly flawed, distressingly compromised, woefully incomplete attempt to establish a basic right that already exists and in most cases has long existed in every other developed nation. It is also the most ambitious and significant piece of domestic legislation to pass in a half century, a big step in the direction of a more perfect union and a more humane one as well. Can you just talk about how you think of these like twin faces of the Affordable Care Act, and what does it tell us about the future of legislation like this, that kind of the best we can get to is, as you describe it, highly flawed and distressingly compromised?
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I don't know how sort of your trajectory on this is, but like, so when I was covering healthcare, when I first learned about healthcare policy, I think, I started an opinion magazine, so I kind of worked backwards to like more reporting, which is weird, but that's how my career trajectory took me. And, I think I started with sort of, a very clear idea of what a universal coverage system should look like. And it was such a no-brainer to me. Like, of course, we should have a universal coverage system and something like we have overseas. And why the heck aren't we doing that already? And actually, I've sort of come full circle on what I think it should act like. If I could clean the board, what I would make it look like. Definitely kind of come more full circle back to where I started. What I never had understood was how hard it is to legislate. It's just so much more complicated. And actually seeing the Republicans fail at repeal kind of reinforced that for me. Like, this is especially on healthcare, where there's so many people invested in the status quo, right? So many industries that are oriented around it, and so many people who have insurance arrangements that even if they don't like them, they're afraid to give it up. It's so hard to get anything done that, I guess it has lowered my expectations a little bit about what you can get done at any one time. And you go back and you look at, if you're a liberal or a progressive, like what are the jewels in terms of programs that we've created over time? And it's always the same, right? It's Social Security, it's Medicare. Well, it's not like those programs were perfect when they passed. Social Security, left out whole categories of workers, domestic workers, whatever. And a lot of that was because they were African Americans, and in the South, that was how you got Southern Democrats. I mean, it's always in American politics, this is like a recurring theme, is that progressive Democrats want to do X, and they have to compromise with more conservative Democrats, and usually somewhere in that formula, race is playing a role in that. So Social Security was really incomplete, and they had to, over time, they expanded it. And the benefits actually weren't that high. In 1965, when Lyndon Johnson signed the bill that created Medicare, that bill also boosted Social Security payments. And so, I mean, that's what, I'm going to do math. That's 30 years. Yeah, the other half of my couple is laughing at me. The applied math. And anyway, now I'm going to get in trouble. 30 years later to kind of really get Social Security to where it is today. Medicare, needed a lot of work. It didn't have a prescription drug benefit. And people forget that, like, Medicare, I think for a lot of progressives, they think of Medicare as something that was not compromised because it was a big government program to cover the elderly. What they're forgetting about that is that Medicare started as a compromise. I mean, it was originally, Harry Truman was trying to cover everybody. That failed. So they were like, okay, so what do we do now? And they decide, okay, well, let's find a really the one politically sympathetic group that also happens to be the one that really we know needs medical care, and let's focus there. And they were able to do that. But even Medicare was compromised, right? There was no cost control in it whatsoever. Medicaid, right? it was a state by state thing. It took a long time before all the states to embrace it. So we always go forward, and even other non-programs. And I came to sort of realize that, progress is always kind of halting like this and incomplete. And it's a tough balance to strike, because you don't want to be saying to say, you don't want to give up your ideals. I mean, part of the reason you're not going to get half a loaf if you start with half a loaf. I think this is something progressives say all the time. I think they get very frustrated. A lot of the Medicare for All advocates, who a lot of them who are very sophisticated, and a lot of them have been working on this for a long time, and they get really frustrated. They're like, they understand that tomorrow there are not the votes in the House and Senate to do Medicare for All, but they also would argue reasonably that if you kind of go in with a compromise offer, that's going to be you're bargaining from your bargaining position. Your starting position is too low. So you don't want to lose that idealism. And there were strategic questions about, that I don't pretend to know the answer to, about like how you balance, shooting for the stars and then knowing when to cut deals. I don't feel like I know that answer at all. But I guess I do feel like from a political standpoint, there's a little bit of a danger that if you don't appreciate the successes you have, you don't recognize that sort of an imperfect step forward is still something to celebrate. There's like a defeatism that can set in. And especially at a time when, one of the reasons healthcare in particular is so hard is that faith in the government is so low at this point. And there's actually saying, Lyndon Johnson, when they passed Medicare, they do polling like, do you trust the government to do the right thing most of the time? And most people said yes. Now most people don't say yes. And if you keep saying that, and if you don't sort of celebrate what government does right, I think that, that's.
Well, one of the other things that feels different is just this like sustained campaign against the Affordable Care Act that you mentioned that kind of pushes you back from writing the book, because the battle just is so much longer than I think any, I certainly did not expect by 2017 we'd be having a massive repeal fight, but you have all the Supreme Court cases. It just doesn't let up. Does that change your opinion of whether things like Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security, these kind of big social reform programs, are possible in the current environment or not? Or kind of, can you just talk a little bit about, was that sustained opposition really different from what we've seen historically?
Yeah, well, it definitely was different. And actually, Obama talked about this when I interviewed him. He cited that as like the big thing. I asked him what he thought he got wrong. And he cited the depth of Republican opposition, but he particularly honed in on what you just mentioned, which is that there wasn't this sort of ability to adjust afterwards, and there wasn't this sort of everybody sort of subsiding. And I think that was different, and that really does complicate things. And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it does affect, I think, the design, like in terms of if you're thinking of the next kind of reform you're going to do. And by the way, I think this would apply just as much to like climate policy as it would to healthcare policy. You definitely need to sort of figure out a way to do this. So like, for example, you're not depending on the states to, make decisions, because, I mean, that's the one where you just sort of, all the Medicaid states that haven't yet expanded Medicaid, like Florida, where, we're being hosted tonight. Still not expanded Medicaid, like more than 1 million people could get insurance. It's like almost free money, and Florida won't take it. So I do think that makes it a lot harder, and I don't know what the answer is. Like I don't know what you do. I think so much of that is a function of politics today, and specifically the way the Republican Party is, and how they're able to use their sort of institutional advantages in American government. Which thing obviously gets talked about a lot. I mean, there's that new book by Adam Jennings, Justice, I never say his name right, on the filibuster. Ezra Klein, who we both know, you worked with for a long time and still work with, has written a whole book on this. And so, I mean, I don't know what there's like American politics feels very broken to me, and I think that does make it hard. And I wish I had an answer on that other than fix American politics, which that makes fixing healthcare look kind of easy.
So let me ask a few questions here from the audience about kind of moving forward, and I'll put two of these together. One is the idea of a public option, a viable pathway forward. And another person watching us asked, Canada manages single payer at the province level. Recently, Colorado created a public option. Medicaid buy-in is being discussed. Is there a state level path to universal coverage? Or would it be more viable to go kind of the Medicare for all, Medicare for America route?
Yeah. So let me start with the public option, and just for people listening, I suspect most of you know what the public option is, but that is the idea. It was part of the original proposal legislation that was going to be the ACA, which was we'd have a government-run insurance program that was available to people on a voluntary basis, and it kind of changed through the course of the debate who could get into it, and then it got dropped because there wasn't support for it. It has come back onto the agenda. Joe Biden endorsed a version of it. There are different versions out there. You can imagine a public option that's really looks like a government-run plan that's open to anybody. Like that's sort of the most ambitious version of it. And that's really, I think for a lot of progressives sounds pretty good, because it's like a voluntary system. And if it works real well, you end up with something that looks like Medicare for all because everyone goes there. There are smaller versions. You can imagine any number of ways to eliminate. You can only let certain people into it. You can say that it's a public option, but actually it's run by private insurers on contract, or it doesn't have the advantages that Medicare has in terms of its buying power to be able to pay less for services. I think any of those are sort of worthwhile steps if you're trying to get, to both for the sake of making healthcare. I think there's a lot of genuine advantages to a public option. A lot of people would like it. And I do think potentially it does kind of move you closer to a Medicare for all system. So in policy, I think it works. I don't know, the politics are kind of hard for me to judge at this point. Figuring out, I imagine this doesn't really come up right away because, we got COVID to deal with. My sense is the Biden administration is probably going to deal with climate and infrastructure before they do a big healthcare push. So, where will politics be in a year or two? Who's in Congress? What does Joe Manchin from West Virginia want to do? I don't know. And then the Canada question, can I do this where I ask you a question? Can I turn this around? You did the article on Canada, how Canada got Medicare for all. So what are the lessons from that for America? If you're a progressive thinking, I want to get there, and you're looking at Canada, what can you take away?
Yeah. Well, so it reminds me, I'm actually going to come back. I listened to prepare for this, to your interview with Terry Gross, where Jonathan got to be interviewed by the wonderful Terry Gross. And it's a very good conversation if you're looking for even more discussion of healthcare. And I think one of the things you mentioned that you learned from the Canada example, it's a lot easier to do it earlier when you have less entrenched interest. So Saskatchewan was the first province in the, I believe it was the 1930s. I might be getting my history a little bit off, but they were the first province to do Medicare for all. And the debate was shockingly similar to the debate we have in the US. The doctors were up in arms. There was actually a doctor strike for 21 days. Hospitals closed, doctor offices closed about this idea of government taking over the healthcare system, which seems very silly to think about. And now Canadians getting up in arms about their healthcare system. Canadians, as someone who grew up in Canada, I have confidence in Canadians really love their healthcare system. But back then, it was the debate felt so similar to the debate we have in the United States, where doctors were opposed to it. They went on strike. It was a whole to-do. But then once it came into place, it actually became popular quite quickly. And after Saskatchewan set up theirs, you see, within a decade, all the other provinces standing up their own systems until you have an entire country with single payer. So I don't know. There's a glass half full, glass half empty. I take from it. The one glass half. I think the thing that'll be encouraging if you're a Medicare for all advocate is that it's hard everywhere. If you look at European countries, if you look at Canada, it's always a bitter, mean fight that doctors oppose to get to it. But I think the thing that is more challenging here is that the medical industry is so much bigger. I think you said on Fresh Air, when they did it, you just didn't have as much of organized opposition. The organized opposition was very, very angry, but they weren't as strong. And that's just, I think that makes it Uwe Reinhardt, the late Princeton economist, would always talk about that he doesn't think it's possible here because of the organized interest in the US, that isn't, he sees that, or he saw that as an insurmountable kind of obstacle. So I don't know. I'm really of two minds about it, whether it was hard everywhere and it's going to be hard here, or the train has kind of left the station in the United States. It's going to be too hard to get to something like what Canada has. I don't know. I don't know which way to think on that.
Yeah. Well, I do think an interesting lesson about that, which I do think applies to the healthcare and actually things like the COVID relief bill. It's a really good reminder. And I think something learned the hard way from the ACA experience is that it's worth a big fight to get to something that's good. If you actually get good policy, you do get rewarded for that in the end. And that's especially true, I think, when you give people benefits. I actually thought one of the fun things I'd say writing the book, and I don't know if this came through or not, but so I was trying to write it like a story, and I was amazed at how many foreshadowing moments happen early in the history. One of my favorites is there's a moment in the 90s when really Republicans are starting to change to become a more hostile obstructionist party. And at the time it's Newt Gingrich, who was sort of Speaker of the House under Clinton, who's really pioneering this. And I found this, I was like, wow, this is too perfect, that there's a quote from a senator who says that Newt Gingrich, he gives obstruction a good name. And who is this brand new elected senator? Who is it? It's Mitch McConnell, right? Fast forward, 20 years, here he is doing his thing. But Bill Kristol, who people now know as a never-Trumper, but, you know, in a previous life was a Republican strategist, and during the Clinton fight wrote a very famous memo urging Republicans to fight the Clinton plan. And his prediction was, if they ever succeed in doing this, you'll never be able to take those benefits away. And actually, here we are. And sure enough, they were not able to take away the ACA. Admittedly, they got very close, but you know, they were not able.
Let me ask you another question we have from our audience. How much do you feel like the general public's expectations or comfort with the idea of government coverage or government guaranteeing health coverage has changed since 2010?
Boy, this is like such a weird thing, how people feel about government. Like you've done a lot of, I remember you did a lot of interviews like, about this. So I'm curious what you think about this. But like, you know, it took me a long time in journalism. Maybe other people realize maybe I'm just a little thick. It took me a while to get this in my head. But that like one of the problems with public opinion and asking is that people have contradictory thoughts. And I don't mean like that in an insulting way, like they're not smart enough. I mean, we all do have, you know, contradictory thoughts. But there's so many people who like don't like government, but they like their Medicare, right? You know, they don't like Obamacare, but they really like the Medicaid they got because Obamacare expanded it. So I do think, like, when I think about the impact of the Affordable Care Act, I do think it's very clear that like the notion of a guarantee of coverage for pre-existing condition has sunk in. Like that is like a big deal now. Like that was not true 10 years ago. It is true now. And I think Republicans, you see that because of how Republicans talk. The Republicans are like bending over backwards. They sound like Obama. We're going to protect people with pre-existing conditions because they know that if they came out on a frontal, like, you know, whatever. And this idea that the government, that there should be a guarantee of coverage for a pre-existing condition, I think has sunk in. And I also think on a practical level, cutting back Medicaid from where it is awfully hard to do. I mean, I sort of thought, you know, in terms of second guessing the Republicans and what they did in the repeal fight. And like, if I was sort of looking back and trying to tell the Republicans, here's how you could have succeeded. I would have done a lot of things differently, obviously. But, you know, I think the fact that they were so determined not just to dial back the Affordable Care Act, but also work in their long-term plan to claw back Medicaid, including the part that really set off a lot of alarm bells among people who depended on that. And, you know, I feel like that program, it's sort of the like ugly child of the healthcare system, and was turned out to be like really popular. Maybe not the name Medicaid, but just as soon as the debate moved from the abstract idea of Medicaid to, hey, like 500,000 people in your state are going to lose healthcare coverage, like that turned out to be really hard to do. But I know you talk to people. Is that your sense that like?
Yeah, well, I think you know, when I think back on the Affordable Care Act, I think, I don't know if it was a mistake or not, but one of the things you saw a lot of, there was a lot of trying to kind of hide that what was Obamacare. I think the most famous example is this anecdote that gets told again and again of the Kentucky governor who was a Democrat being at some state enrollment fair where some guy says, you know, I hate Obamacare, but I love my Kentucky Connect, not knowing that Connect is actually Obamacare in his state. And it was somewhat done out of necessity, I think, you know, to get people to sign up. Obamacare was such a polarizing term, but it also, you know, people weren't getting little cards in the mail that said they had Obamacare. They were getting cards that said they had Blue Cross or Aetna or United or whatever they were purchasing, and they were, you know, buying it on the Kentucky Connect or whatever other marketplace was in their state. So I don't know if that government, you know, I think you're right that what's really changed is this idea that pre-existing conditions should not be a thing that exists. I had a kind of funny moment a year or two ago before the pandemic where I was lecturing some college students and someone raised their hand and said, what's a pre-existing condition? And I felt so old because but you know, this person, what they were like, you know, 20 years old, they were 10 or so when the Affordable Care Act passed. They just grew up in a world where like, of course, everyone gets health insurance. Like, what would that even be? So I think that is really what's changed. This idea that insurance companies should not be able to deny anyone is the real shift that's happened over. I think that strikes me as like the big shift in attitude over the past decade. I think we're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes, but I think I want to end with hearing a little bit more about your interview with President Obama. I'd love to just know more about what you learned, what he was like to interview. It seems like he was quite eager to talk about health policy, that you're only supposed to have a half hour, but it ran a little bit long.
Yeah. No, he was happy to talk about it. It was a funny interview. It was like a year ago. It was right before the pandemic really kind of changed life in retrospect. And and as I say in the book, I mean, he looked very casual, right? I mean,
no socks, right?
No socks. He was so excited. He had like bare ankles. But he talks in that way, and I'm guilty of this too, so I shouldn't make fun of it. But he does talk with these very long sentences that are stuffed with like 8 dependent clauses because he wants to get the nuances just right, which I appreciate. It is a little frustrating if you only have a limited amount of time. You're trying to get a lot of material in because you really can't interrupt him. I did actually start interrupting him at the end.
We ran into this when Ezra and I interviewed him.
Yes.
We ran into the same.
Yes. He does. He likes to talk, and I mean, it's not like he's not giving blather. I mean, he's actually saying things. So like, it's not like but he does. He wants to get that nuance. Again, I think he's like, I always thought, we used to talk about this when I was the New Republic, when he was first running, he would have been a really good journalist, columnist, or like a magazine writer, because he sees like every side of every issue in a way that's probably not politically helpful if you're the president, but like it does make you like an interesting writer. He's thought a lot about this, obviously. He's very invested in it. And it was funny, things I got wrong. I remember when he was running for president and a bunch of us wrote articles and we decided he wasn't that into healthcare. Like that wasn't the thing. And in retrospect, if we really understood his background, I think we would have been clear, but he really wanted to do it. I think it was partly because of, the personal experience. He's also someone, I think the way to get Barack Obama to want to do something is to tell you can't do it. Right? I mean, he does have a healthy ego. And I think he has this idea, like, we should be able to do this because it's a hard problem to solve. Don't tell me we can't. And I think he's thought a lot about that. And I think he's thought a lot about, it was very clear, like, I wasn't sure if I was going to have to kind of pull out of him to talk about the structural problems in American politics. And he went right there on his own. I mean, he was just like, we got to fix this. Like, you just can't be, he talked about the Senate in particular, which is something we're talking about now, but like to have a system where basically senators representing 20 or 30% of the country can block something because of the way the Senate assigns seats, and then you throw the filibuster on it. That's not going to work. Like, there's no accountability there. And we've seen that. And he's very, I think he got very worked up about that. And I think, he really, when we were talking about the Medicaid thing, where Republican governors not expanding Medicaid, like, that really got to him. Like, and the other stuff, he was professorial, do you know what I mean? But like, you could just see, like, that really upset him. Like, almost as like, what's wrong with these people? Like, I understand we're having a political fight, and I understand you want to win elections, but come on, these are like millions of people who need healthcare, and you can give it to them. You can fight me about something else. And it really, I think, just shook his faith, because he's such so much faith in humanity. I think fundamentally he's a kind of optimistic kind of person, and I think it just really shook his faith a little bit. So it was interesting. I will say one last thing, and you may appreciate this. He was in the middle of writing his memoir when I interviewed him, and the condition one of the conditions of the interviews that took me forever to negotiate this was I had to hold on to the material until my book came out, because they were doing, his interview, and he did. He beat me up. Boy, it's really great when you're going to do a book and the president scoops you with a New Yorker excerpt. So I asked him as we were walking out. I said to him, "How's your memoir going?" And he said, he said, "It's like exercise. It's like, I really like having exercised. I don't like exercising." He said, like, every once in a while I get like a paragraph and I'm like, yeah, I really nailed it. That's great. But otherwise, it's like, it's a real grind, and it's just, I'm glad I did it, but like, I don't love doing it. And he's like, well, you know what that's like. And I'm like, yeah, but like, this is all I do. And like, you also like do your thing. So it was a little bit humbling, but anyway, there you go.
Well, I'm glad to hear even the president finds it challenging to write sometimes. That's somewhat reassuring. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
So much fun.
And the book, again, even as someone who's been covering this for years, it was such a wonderful narrative of the characters involved and the lessons to think about a decade out. I would highly recommend it to anyone who's interested, not just in healthcare, but just in how our government works. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Christina.
Thank you so much. That was just a marvelous conversation. I've been taking notes. I've been learning a lot. I just want to thank you for coming to Books and Books, to our virtual bookshop, and joining us tonight. And just remind everyone who's watching from everywhere that you can order the book from Books and Books below by just pressing the green button, and we'll ship it right out to you, or you can come by one of our stores if you're in Miami. And just thank you so much for the work that you're doing, that you have done on our behalf. And I hope that things do change and become more perfect and more humane at some point. But that was a wonderful conversation. And I love the fact that there were so many people, there's so many questions. There are questions coming in right now. I can see them. So people still want to learn more. So order the book, read it. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Good night. Good night, everybody. Bye.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Jonathan.